This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 357, GraphQL. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about GraphQL with Alexander Varweg. Alexander is the lead front-end engineer at OpenSocial, who built his first website for his sports club, we'll learn more about that, over 10 years ago using Drupal 7. He's a contributor to the GraphQL module and the GraphQL PHP library. He helps OpenSocial's Drupal developers in the adoption of GraphQL and is leading the development of a new front end using GraphQL, React, and Rescript. And Alexander, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'm John Picozzi, and today my co-hosts are joining us for his second time, Ryan Price. Ryan is a solutions architect at FFW, who's involved in Drupal, who's been involved in the Drupal community since 2006. Ryan, welcome back.
Hi, everyone, and hopefully I will be able to hang on this whole time. I have a sick 2-year-old at my house today.
We'll be okay. I think we understand the trials and tribulations of having kids. So, joining us as well with an electrician in his house, Nick Laughlin.
Yeah, this is reminiscent of our early days when I'd be recording from a Starbucks or something. So yeah, it might be a little noisy on my side too. And since we've got somebody in the house, if you're watching the video, I've got a mask on, so it might be a little muffled, but just trying to stay safe. So
I'm confused though. Electricity is so quiet. You only really hear like a dull buzz every so often. So
until he drills the holes to run the wires.
I kind of want to see I want to see somebody drilling a hole like into one of your Lego sets and just see it like teetering towards the edge. Like
no.
No. We're not doing that. All right. So we have an update this week, and it comes from a listener. Nick, you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we had some listener feedback from Amit. Thank you, Amit, for sending us that email. He mentioned after listening to our episode from last week talking about the book module that there is an issue on Drupal.org right now sponsoring book to be removed from core. So if that's something that you use, apparently there's a policy in Drupal, which I think makes sense, that if modules are used by less than 5% of the install base, they should be removed before the next major version. So if you think book should be an exception, you should comment on that issue, which will be in the show notes, or you should install it on more sites so that more than 5% of users are using the book module.
It's interesting because Emmett actually he sent us an email, and a lot of the points that he made in it where he found issues with the book module, like he said that he loved using the book module and saw a use case for it, but he highlighted some things that he thought, like around permissions, that he thought could be better. And I'm wondering if when it goes to the contrib space, if it'll be easier for people to kind of fix those things because they won't necessarily have to make a change to Drupal core. So I will not install the book module more. I will not comment on the issue. I will let it do what it's going to do.
I'm going to set up a cron job that sets up Gitpod to install book module 1,000 times a day until
you'd like to send Nick messages about his cron job, we'll find out his contact information at the end of the show. Let's move on. We actually have a drop-in or a note from the New England Drupal camp, which Nick and I helped to organize. So here's Stephen to tell you more.
The New England Drupal camp is back in person at Rhode Island College in November. NedCamp, as we call it, is a 2-day Drupal camp, Friday being a training day and Saturday sessions. Session submissions are now open. New presenters are encouraged and welcome. Did you know Nick and John are camp founders and are still on the organizing team? Join John and Nick and the other New England Drupalers in November. You can learn more. Visit nedcamp.org.
Thanks, Stephen. We're looking forward to everybody coming to Providence in November. So as Stephen said, you can find out more at nedcamp.org. All right, let's jump into our primary topic. I am super excited to talk about this because I know about GraphQL, and you can tell by the way I said that like I know enough to like say, hey, it's GraphQL. But I'm really looking forward to kind of jumping in and learning a bunch more about it today. So, Alexander, let's start with the really basic softball question. What is GraphQL?
Okay. So GraphQL is a query language. That's the QL in the name. I think there's been some debate on whether it's actually a graph or not. I don't have a math background, so that's a debate I'm not getting into. But it was originally designed by Facebook to make the data that they have accessible within their products, and they also use it internally. And I think what is the real power of GraphQL is that it puts all the tools in the hands of the clients to specify what data it needs. So that's where the query language of it comes in, is that the clients can ask the server for the data that they want.
So can it be used, like you say in query, right? And when I think query, I think like, hey, MySQL database, let's query this thing. Can it be used to query a database like MySQL, or is it just for like ingesting APIs?
No, not directly. So the GraphQL language would always be used by a GraphQL client to query a GraphQL server. And then the way that these both behave is actually defined by the GraphQL specification. So this was originally started by Facebook, but is now owned and maintained by the GraphQL Foundation. So there is a specification document that actually very clearly outlines how this works and how the type system of GraphQL works. I think that's, if we start getting into differences maybe with something like JSON API, then GraphQL has its own internal type system that you use to define what a GraphQL API would look like and how a client would talk to it.
Yeah, my understanding is one of the powers of GraphQL is it's generally meant to be against NoSQL databases, so you can build those relationships kind of on the fly. And you can point it against something like MySQL or Postgres, but you have to have some sort of mapping layer in between.
Yeah, exactly. So in GraphQL, we often talk about resolvers, which is what runs on the server. And a resolver takes a part of a GraphQL request, usually a field, and then goes and fetches data for it. And what that data source actually is, could be anything. It could be a database, it could be a flat file, it could be another GraphQL API as well. So while with GraphQL you don't query the data source directly, you would query a server that knows how to actually fetch the data using those resolvers.
Yeah, when I think about GraphQL, I think for me the killer app of it is that when I ask for information, I'm allowed to describe the way that I want to get it back, right? So I can say, please give me an object called solar system, and I want to have in there planet, and I want to have the mass of the planet and the distance from the sun, but all that other stuff that you know about planets, please just don't tell me. But I do want you to tell me the names of the moons and what all of their other possible nicknames are, and you can like dive really, really, really deep and get a bunch of information about the moons without having to do like a join statement. You can just say, give me all this information, get it in one giant object graph tree thing, and then when I get it back, I've essentially done this sort of like one query for my whole page, whatever it is that I'm trying to render, and then I move on and I may never have to go back to the server again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really designed to be able to say, to express all of your data needs in a single query, rather than have the client go back and forth to the server to keep fetching additional data as it learns more about the data.
So what are the main use cases for GraphQL then?
So I can give some examples of organizations using GraphQL. So of course there's Facebook who use it internally. Funnily enough, they don't expose it publicly. They do have a Graph API, but that is not a GraphQL API. It's just named the Graph API. Shopify does have a public GraphQL API, and it uses it for all its admin and shop-related data. So that's really meant to build, applications that use data from Shopify, like storefronts. Similarly, GitHub exposes all of their repository data and data about organizations and users using GraphQL. And they actually say in their documentation that the GraphQL API they offers a more precise and flexible query than the GitHub REST API. So they're also really trying to push their API users towards GraphQL because they can more specifically, fetch data. If you look at GraphQL itself, it's based around 3 operations. The first operation is query, so that's really for fetching data. Then you also have the mutation operation, which is to make a change. And while the name is mutation, you could also provide mutation fields in GraphQL with the name of an action. So I have seen at GraphQL Galaxy, which is a conference around GraphQL, that people have built remote procedure calls on the GraphQL specification. I don't think it was something they would necessarily recommend, but it's definitely possible. And the final GraphQL operation is actually subscriptions, which you can use to set up a real-time connection and to get data from the server as it's created on the server or as new events happen. So you can receive live updates on the client.
So that's actually interesting that you can do real-time. It kind of makes me wonder, when you think about other ways that we could get output from an API or other ways that we could describe an API, pretty native to Drupal at this point is the JSON API spec. It definitely has its own sort of like set of achievements that it can get to in challenges. But what are some of the main differences between something like GraphQL and JSON API?
So this is actually something we've had quite a debate about at OpenSocial before we decided to adopt GraphQL. And I think the outcome is that you can achieve probably whatever you want with either method. So whenever people are trying to choose, I always say slightly unhelpful that it doesn't matter too much. But for us, it really came down to where do you want to put the bulk of the effort. I think JSON API works really well for Drupal because from a server perspective, it's really easy to adopt since I can just map my data to the API and then let the clients figure out how they want to assemble that data. That means you put a lot of the burden with the client, and you're going to need tools like React Query to help you fetch that efficiently and make sure that you use includes properly to actually fetch whole objects and make sure you don't have to make 10 requests to the API. And I think GraphQL can really shine in that area of unburdening the client. And that's also why we chose it at OpenSocial, because you will need to do quite a bit more work on the server, I think, especially with Drupal. But that does mean that you do that effort on the server and that your client can be a lot simpler because it can just say, this is the data I want in the shape that I want it, and this is the data I get. And I think that's very powerful. At OpenSocial, we have a lot more backend developers than we do front-end developers. So it makes sense to actually push that burden to the backends.
Yeah, one thing I think about, I think I mentioned this already about doing like a database join is, something like JSON API. If the data is not available in the one call that you made, now you're sort of having to go make a couple of round trips. But at the same time, the stress of having to implement that for the backend developers is pretty minimal. So there's definitely some trade-offs. Like GraphQL, I've definitely heard people talk about. I haven't done much with it myself on the back end, but having to make the middleware sort of robust enough to support all the different things that people might ever want to do with it can take some time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes it can also, you have to be careful because it can be a lot slower in some cases too. So for example, I'm working on a project right now that uses GraphQL extensively. it's not even a Drupal project, but they're using Postgres in the back end, and then they use GraphQL to allow like a really robust API, as you said. But when you have really complex queries that cross multiple services, especially if you're in a microservice architecture, then those can become very, very slow, because each time you cross that boundary, you need to, like GraphQL on the backend has to make those round trips. So those requests can take a lot of time. So there are still cases where even if you're using GraphQL primarily, sometimes you write some queries in the backend and then expose those to GraphQL so people can get those responses, but you're doing all the joins properly in the, with the direct SQL call or something, just so that it's more efficient.
I would challenge the conclusion that means that GraphQL is slow, especially if you're saying like we talk to different different services. Like that's true, but if you would do that in another API shape, you would probably still have those boundary crossings and
so it's a limitation of product architecture, not a limitation of GraphQL. And that's true of, like you said, of any other API too. Like, so there's still, it's not, the point is it's not a cure-all. It's not like you put GraphQL and put it in and then you can join infinite levels of data and have it still be performant. You still need to kind of pay attention to metrics. But
I mean, isn't the idea there really that it, like, your request is more is more pinpointed as to what you want to get back, right? So like, as opposed to, I think Ryan said this earlier, as opposed to like, doing a direct query in MySQL and writing a bunch of joins, or using JSON API and having to call like 3 different APIs and get all of their data back, and then pulling like each little piece that you need from each one. You can say, hey, GraphQL, I need this, this, and this, and it'll basically return this, this, and this, which makes the request a lot smaller and a lot more manageable, right? That's the goal there.
Yeah. The GraphQL API would still need to go fetch that. So if the client makes up a query that crosses 3 services, then you would need to do those individual requests. But I do think one of the interesting things about knowing all the data the user wants is that you can start thinking about smart optimizations and parallelizing those on the server. But that is definitely an implementation cost that you would have to carry to actually get those benefits.
So I mean, my GraphQL to me seems kind of like almost like a middleware layer where I'm assuming you can manipulate the results. Like if somebody puts a request in, you can manipulate the results you send back before you give it to them, like as far as the format of that and all that, right?
Yeah. So that's where the resolvers come in. I think if we start looking, for example, at how this works in Drupal, then resolvers in Drupal are very much using the API, the entity API, to go fetch data. But that could mean that a single field in a response actually uses multiple entity types to generate the data.
Sure.
So that's one of the powers, at least for us at OpenSocial, that we thought is we often have things that are slightly related or that maybe use more than one piece of data to get to a value. And resolvers make that really easy because our API shape is in no way tied to our data storage.
Interesting. So we talked earlier on about common use cases. I'm wondering, how you've seen people using GraphQL today, and if there are any interesting use cases you've seen either at OpenSocial or outside in the wider community.
So one of the interesting use cases that at least I find interesting that I've built myself at OpenSocial is our real-time chat. So this is actually the data storage is powered by Drupal. Drupal itself does not support persistent connections, so Drupal cannot handle subscriptions. But what we essentially did is we built a separate PHP service that could handle the subscription aspect and would just communicate with the Drupal installation to serve those.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's how we got the real-time chat working as a feature on top of a Drupal site. I did a lightning talk about that at GraphQL Galaxy that details a little bit more on the architecture and the technologies involved.
So dumb guy question, like super high level. So both folks involved in the chat, or all the folks involved in the chat, if it's a multi-person chat, I would imagine, are using some sort of front end interface, maybe it's React, whatever, connecting to GraphQL, and then GraphQL is basically going out to Drupal, which is the data store, and pulling the relevant pieces and kind of stitching them together to make that chat experience.
Yeah, exactly. So basically what we did is we have the subscription server, which handles the subscription operation of a GraphQL request. Mm-hmm. So every user would be running a GraphQL client within the user interface that would set up a connection using WebSockets and just send this subscription operation over the socket connection. And then sending a chat message is actually a mutation. Mm-hmm. So that's just a field that's literally named send message. That would go directly to Drupal. And then we use the event system in Drupal to put an event on RabbitMQ that is then seen by this subscription service, which would then fetch the data actually from the Drupal GraphQL API, forward that into the subscription WebSocket connection to push the update to the clients that are connected.
Sounds easy.
It took a good 9 months to figure out build and get into production. But yeah, once, like, in hindsight, it's in hindsight it's doable. It was a challenge figuring out how to actually serve the subscriptions while storing the data in Drupal.
I'm going to go down one small rabbit, well, maybe not small, but we're going to go down one rabbit hole here. I'm just curious, why this solution for a chat client as opposed to a third-party service or an existing solution?
So OpenSocial builds community software that we sell to our customers in a software as a service fashion. And each of our customers have their own installation because we like, one of our primary selling points and something that we find very important is privacy. There are chat services out there that would probably have been easier to integrate, but they usually want payment per installation. So scaling this out across all of our customers would quickly, cause costs to go up. Yep. The secondary consideration is that if we have an external chat service, that also means we need to get all of our customers to agree that that chat service is going to be handling and storing their data. Mm-hmm. Whereas right now we can just say, look, all the chat messages being sent on your platform are going to be stored in the same Drupal database that is already handling all of the other user data and other content that they may find important.
Makes sense.
So what are some of the big challenges when you start integrating Drupal with GraphQL?
I think the first one is understanding the GraphQL Drupal module. If you look at GraphQL in the wider PHP ecosystem, there's actually a GraphQL library that mimics the JavaScript implementation of the GraphQL specification. It does so in a way that actually mimics the file structure of the JavaScript implementation, which is sometimes a little weird if you're used to PHP. But as someone who didn't know the GraphQL implementation and wanted to contribute a feature to that library, it actually meant I could mostly just translate what was happening already in the JavaScript implementation. So I didn't need to reinvent the wheel. What the Drupal module actually does is it takes that library and it links it up with Drupal's plugin system so that you can actually define your schema and actually define your resolvers. I did a deep dive about this at DrupalCon North America on really going into the weeds of how the module works internally. And I will be giving the same presentation at DrupalCon Europe if people are there. But at the moment, one of the difficulties that users face when they start out with looking at the module is that there's two versions. There's version 3 of the module. And what that did is actually do the same as the JSON API, which is it takes the data model of Drupal and it tries to expose all of that as a GraphQL API. And that works. It's easy to get you up and running, but you lose some of those advantages of GraphQL, of really being able to shape the API towards the use cases of your clients, rather than just dumping out your data model. So the maintainers of the Drupal module actually made a new version, version 4, and that did things completely differently. It doesn't really give you anything out of the box except the examples that are included in the module. And it requires you to write your own schema using the GraphQL schema definition language, and then actually describe in a schema plugin how that schema maps to resolvers, which are usually Drupal plugins that actually know how to fetch the data and provide a value. There has been some community work being done to create the GraphQL Compose, I believe it's called, module, that brings back some of that version 3 functionality to automatically expose your data in the GraphQL schema, but that's now opt-in rather than the default.
So it sounds like it's actively supported, but many times it requires some technical expertise to really implement fully.
Yeah, unless you're satisfied with just exposing your data model as a GraphQL API, which can still work very well if you're saying, hey, I just have a Drupal website and I want to make a decoupled front end and I maintain both of these. But if you're really thinking about building an API that may also be used by other clients, other consumers, that you may not necessarily handle yourself, then you would probably have to invest some time in actually crafting or designing a GraphQL schema.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's something I hear pretty commonly as GraphQL for an internal team. Implementing it for yourself is way different than implementing it for the wide public. So we mentioned the chat application. Are there other notable uses of GraphQL inside OpenSocial?
So one of the things we're currently working on outside of the chat is really to get our API up and running. One of the things that a colleague of mine has worked on is integrating OAuth authentication with GraphQL. So we can now specify in our schema what kind of access rules a user would need to actually be able to access the data. And that is for us also really with an eye on being able to build an API that can be used by external developers to create applications against the social platforms that we host. And that's actually one of the interesting things we're running into now, is that a lot of sites either create a private API or a public API, and we're actually building one that will serve both, because we also want to build a new React frontend that uses the API to create the decoupled frontend rather than the Drupal frontend we're currently using, and eventually also move our mobile app over to using the GraphQL API.
Yeah,
cool.
I don't know it off the top of my head for GraphQL, but I know like for OpenAPI, Swagger definition, there's not really a great way to say what things you're allowed to do unless you're using OpenAPI. There's sort of like a loophole there. Or sorry, not OpenAPI. We just said what it was called.
JSON API?
No, OAuth. The other word that starts with O. OAuth. OAuth has this sort of spec that says what sort of grants you have, I think they call it. But other means of authentication, I know in JSON API, don't have a way of describing your sort of permissions. So I don't know, does GraphQL have a way of describing what you're allowed to do? Or is it sort of like, if you have this, everything that's in our API is open to you?
So GraphQL has something that is known as directives. And this is defined in the specification. And directives are either client or server defined extensions to GraphQL, if you will, that direct a client or server to adopt a certain kind of behavior. So what we've done for the OAuth integration with GraphQL is on the server side, we've defined these directions, and they look a little bit like like annotations as you would see in PHP doc. So they start with the @ symbol and then have a name and optionally some arguments. And we've said we can either add those to a field or to a type. And in those directives, we'll specify what scope a client needs to actually be able to access that data or to access that, that type or field. And then the server can look into the schema, see those directives, and match that to an incoming GraphQL request that has some OAuth scopes attached to it.
But yeah, that's already pretty super advanced. If you're talking about like, certain methods or certain fields that are only accessible, you've probably already gone way down the rabbit hole into API implementation land. So for someone who's just wanting to try this out, don't worry about. You probably just have all the permissions or none.
So it by default, the GraphQL module does integrate with the permission, just the permission system. So the way that you could do this is if you have some data in your API that needs some kind of Drupal permission, you could just make a request as a logged in user, and in your resolver, make sure that you're using the entity API correctly so that your query does the access check, or do an explicit permission check and just return empty data or an error if the permission isn't there. So OAuth for us was really this advanced solution where we want to have different types of clients, so both our internal clients, but also external clients that we may not know, and really be able to specify this throughout our API and document it as well.
Does your company maintain any of those clients? Like, is there like a open social mobile app or something that runs on a television or anything fun like that?
So the React frontend is what I'm working on. That's currently still in the beginning phases. So while we have our chat has been built, is running in production, is being maintained. For a wider API, we're really still getting started. So actually building this OAuth integration was one of the first important steps for us.
I just wanted to piggyback or clarify something that you just said. So the GraphQL Drupal module out of the box will observe Drupal permissioning. So if you are just getting started and you're hacking away and you don't have access to a content type or something like that, that will carry through when you query GraphQL or through GraphQL. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's good to know, because that's always a concern for folks, I would imagine.
Yeah. So if you get a little bit technical, then basically we've contributed this. We've contributed additions to the simple OAuth module, and then the actual integration with GraphQL has been published as the OAuth GraphQL module. I would have to look it up. It's either OAuth GraphQL or GraphQL OAuth. And what that basically does is it sets a different user when it senses that the request uses OAuth authentication. And then it basically delegates to the Drupal permission system, but it overrides a little bit what that would respond with, depending on the scopes that are available in the request. So say you're not using OAuth, then you would still have the Drupal permission system, and you would either make your GraphQL request as an authenticated user, which is what we're actually doing for chat because we didn't have OAuth scopes yet, or as an anonymous user. You would only be able to load anonymous data, given that you write your data producers correctly. Because if you write a data producer where you disable access checks, then you won't have access checks anymore.
Right, and we shouldn't write those. We should always do the access checks.
Yes.
Security first.
Yes.
So earlier on, you said that Facebook kind of created GraphQL, and Facebook's using GraphQL, and that might make some people feel icky. So I'm wondering how involved Facebook still is in GraphQL, and who decides what's in GraphQL, and is there a standard around it similar to something like, I don't know, PHP or any of the other languages that are out there?
Yeah. So GraphQL itself is actually mostly a specification that you could find at spec.graphql.org. And similarly, the graphql.org is the main introduction website, I would say, to GraphQL. And both of these are actually owned and maintained by the GraphQL Foundation. So they were transferred ownership of the GraphQL trademark and the spec. And there is, within that foundation, there is a GraphQL working group of people who actually work on the specification, and mostly guide the process of contributions that work on the specification, and request for comments to propose new features actually happens in a GitHub repository. So anyone can see what is being discussed. Anyone can log in and weigh in. I've actually done this in the past, just given my feedback of, hey, I'm seeing this, we're doing something with it, and this would be the impact for us. This is why it does sometimes take quite long. So I think one of the features that has been open for quite a long time is input unions. And an input type in GraphQL defines what fields and types you can give to a mutation as user input. And a union allows you to select of one of the different types. And an input union type would allow you to do that for mutation input. But there's been a lot of discussion about what would be the best implementation for that, and what are the trade-offs with the existing language, existing use cases, but also with future extendability of the language. And I think there's now contributors from quite a few different companies actually part of the core GraphQL working group. But if you are running into something that you would like to see added to the language or the specification, then you could open up your own issue in the repository. But you'll have to commit to some time and work to actually champion that and work with feedback.
So people don't have to feel icky about potentially using something that Facebook has its hands in.
It reminds me of one of the very early days of React. Discussion that I heard people having, was like, well, what happens if Facebook decides to take their toys and go home? But I think they've kind of proven themselves in the last, whatever it was, 10 years or more, to be pretty good open source citizens. And, once a project gets used by enough people, like React's definitely in this camp, it'll get forked before it, goes away.
Yeah, I think if you look at the organizations using it besides Facebook, like Shopify, GitHub, Airbnb, there's some big names there who are also invested in making sure that GraphQL continues. And since most of their APIs are public, and they also want to have developers come work with them that already knows this, they're also invested in making sure that it continues in a public fashion. So that's not necessarily a risk I see for GraphQL.
So my next question is this then. So you mentioned that there's an organization that maintains kind of contributions to GraphQL, but GraphQL itself is mostly just a spec. So my question is, when you're customizing things, are you mostly customizing that in your implementation, or do you really need to work on, like you mentioned the input merging? Is that really just like a feature request because there's no like spec and agreed way to do it, and you can kind of do it yourself if you want to, but you're not sure if it's going to be supported long term, or is there an actual project you can contribute to as well?
So the idea is really that you stick to the specification, because you want to make sure that the API that you build can work with all of these different clients like Apollo, like Relay. Having said that, there's actually a lot possible within the type system of GraphQL itself. So quite a bit of the automation or features from GraphQL clients have actually just been built by saying, I expect this shape of data. One of the earliest things I think was, for example, pagination by the Relay client, where they said, we expect this shape of data to be returned for results rather than a simple list. and that allows us to automate fetching a page of data and then getting the next page. Another feature that I mentioned before with the OAuth that GraphQL has built in is directives. And these are really made to be specified by the server or by the client. I think the only two default directives that are part of the specification are the skip and if specification. So one of the interesting constraints for GraphQL clients is that GraphQL queries have to be static, or at least you could create dynamic queries at runtime, but you'll probably run into some issues with your client or performance reasons. But by using variables, which are also part of the GraphQL specification in your query, you can actually use these two directives to tell the server, hey, I only want to have this part of the response if the value that I pass in is true or false. So if you know that your user maybe has disabled a feature, then you can tell the server, hey, skip this if the user has disabled this feature. And the client would have to pass along the actually true or false value. Other interesting directives that the community is working on is the stream and the defer directives. So stream is for lists, and this allows the client to indicate, hey, I know that if I add this stream directive to a list and the server supports it, that you can give me an initial result set, and then outside of the GraphQL response, you can maybe add more results for this list. Similarly, defer is for fragments of a GraphQL query, where you can tell the server, hey, it's okay to send me this response and just send the fragment of the query later. So using these directives, you can really develop the API and add new features and functionalities while still being spec compliant. One of the things that is defined in the GraphQL specification is actually how to inspect or introspect a GraphQL API. So that way, any GraphQL client can ask the server, hey, what does your data shape, what does your API shape look like? And also, what kind of directives do you support? So that's how a client may know whether these stream or defer directives are available.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting part of, like what makes GraphQL interesting. I think we talked about that at the very beginning, but being able to discover all the things that are possible, that sort of it was a build from the ground up to make that possible, right? That was the whole point, was APIs. The documentation was very fragmented, and sometimes it wasn't documented at all. You just sort of had to start making calls and see what came back. But GraphQL is sort of meant to be this very discoverable, almost human readable kind of a thing. And if you look at some of the clients, do you have a favorite client that you're using when you're doing API development, and how has that enabled you to discover new things about GraphQL and what is possible?
So there's actually two that I've used. The first is Urql, URQL, which is made by Formidable Labs, a web development agency. That's what's currently powering our real-time chat. I think their caching system has been really interesting in how, their method for how you would update the cache, how you can write functions to do that and respond to new data, and be really selective about what you update on the client side and cause maybe changes in your UI. The second one is actually Relay, which is created by Facebook. So using more Facebook technology to build community platforms. And that has actually been what we've chosen to use for our new web front end. And the reason for that is that I've partnered with someone who works in the Rescript community, who actually maintains the Rescript bindings for the Relay client. And he's been doing some really cool work building a router that integrates very closely with GraphQL and Rescript. So that's also where things like defer come in, where we can really match a query to the shape of our UI and decide on a very granular level what data is important for us to have immediately, and where we could maybe show a spinner and wait a little bit longer for the data.
Yeah. So if you had to onboard, a new person to your team tomorrow, where would you send them? Like, what's the first three things you would tell somebody who says, all right, I have to start working with GraphQL, or I want to, incorporate a GraphQL API into some application that I'm using?
Yeah, so I think the first resource that I would point people to is actually graphql.org. It's basically the community maintained site that explains what is GraphQL, gives you the basics, and is a good jumping off point to other platforms. All of the developers that join OpenSocial actually are given a copy of the production-ready GraphQL book by Marc-André Giroux. And that is a book that I wish I had when I got started, because I've been doing a lot of searching around the internet, trying to solve all these problems that I encountered while working on the chat, finding different blog posts that were either maybe a bit older or sometimes like really new, and really, trying to figure out all these solutions myself. Then I found the book, and it basically takes you from knowing nothing about GraphQL to an introduction of what it is, designing, actually thinking about security, thinking about things like rate limiting, taking it into production, and also taking it beyond having it in production and evolving your API.
That's great.
Contrary to something like JSON API, GraphQL doesn't actually have versions. So this means that you need to think about how are you going to add fields. You'll probably have to deprecate fields at some point, where you'll just have to say to users, hey, we're monitoring how often these fields get called, and by some date we'll actually remove them. But I've heard stories from companies where they deprecated a field, but just saw that usage kept going up because there was no alternative to the field. So they decided, well, okay, we'll have to keep supporting the field because apparently it's useful to our clients. So things like that are all covered in the book, and we give a copy of that to everyone that joins us and starts working on GraphQL.
That's super interesting. So can we go down the rabbit hole one last time on the deprecation angle, right? So like, I build this API out, I'm using the API, and then I decide, well, we're going to deprecate this thing, right? What does that look like, both obviously from the user side, it's like, hey, this goes away and you get some sort of error message, but like from a developer standpoint, do you have to kind of code around the deprecation as far as like, hey, we're going to deprecate this and here's the error message you're going to get, or does GraphQL just kind of handle that out of the box?
So there's a deprecation or deprecated directive that you could add to a field. And ideally, you would include in that a message that says why it's deprecated, what you would recommend other people to do, and maybe what is the scheduled removal date. I think Shopify has quite a clearly defined process for this, for example, where they also publish this information to developers, and they take quite a long time period to actually remove a field. So between deprecation and removal, there may be quite some time. I think one of the most important parts of designing a GraphQL API, and that's actually where we now spend most of our time, is thinking about this ahead of time and being specific in naming your fields. You may be really tempted to name a field image because it's an image, but try to suggest instead to your clients what the image is going to be used for. For example, is it actually the avatar of the user, or is it their hero image, or maybe their favorite image on the platform? And by being a bit more specific ahead of time in your naming of fields, you're giving more clarity in your API, and you're also avoiding having to rename fields in the future because the name you really want is already taken.
So you're saying we shouldn't just call them image 1, image 2, image 3?
I mean, if you always have 3 images and that makes sense for your client application, go ahead and do it. But I wouldn't know how to use that API. So
similar to Drupal, once you name a field, it's not the easiest thing in the world to change it. So think before you name, right?
Yeah.
I mean, names are a resource. You should treat them as a valuable resource, and that's true of many things. So, Alexander, thank you for joining us. This has been a great discussion on GraphQL. It feels like we dove in deep, but it was also pretty introductory, which I think is helpful, both for the 3 of us on the show and for our listeners. So thank you for joining us. But before we close out the show, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Actually. So one of the things that caught me off guard when I was getting into GraphQL, and I think this may be the case for many people using Drupal, is that I was always really used to thinking about things in HTTP requests and also HTTP semantics. And I think one of the things I would like to say to people is that it's important to realize that GraphQL itself is not tied to a transport mechanism. So it only defines like the data shapes of the request and the response. But I could write this on a piece of paper, fax it to you or email it to you, and you could send it back to me, and we would still be spec compliant. So it can also be done over a real-time connection like WebSockets. Like I say, for the real-time chat, we only use it for subscriptions, but we could also send our queries and mutations over that same WebSocket connection. And one question that people may have then is, how do I cache? There's actually a really good video about that by Marc-André Guéroult, who explains that if you have a spectrum of API customizability to cacheability, then you'll see that as APIs become more and more customizable, they'll become less easy to cache. And with customizable, I mean that the client can request more customized requests. So that's a video that I'll add to the show notes, and definitely worth checking out for anyone who may be wondering, how do I cache GraphQL and how do I deal with that problem? So
going back to, like, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes ago now, when we were talking about, basically getting the information you need out of GraphQL, right? GraphQL kind of doing that join for you and querying those data points for you. Is there a mechanism or an ability to cache at that point where GraphQL can look at a cached data set as opposed to like having to actually go out and get the data set and do the stuff to it?
Yeah, so there's a few levels. The Drupal module actually handles this on a field level, where it'll look at the fields, like the inputs that you may give to a field, as well as any context, like is there maybe differences in permissions, and you can specify those in the resolvers that you write, and it can store the outputs for a field, and if it sees, hey, the inputs and the context are the same, I can just give back the result rather than recalculating it. Mm-hmm. You can also do this on a request, although usually at that scale it's slightly less useful because things may differ too much between requests. One of the things that has been created as an extension to GraphQL is actually persistent queries. So what I can do is I can tell the server ahead of time, this is a query that I'm going to need in my application. I'll post it to /GraphQL/queries, and the server will give me back an identifier. And rather than sending the entire request, I can just send back the ID. So that doesn't really do caching directly, but it does allow me to transport a GraphQL query over GET, and it reduces the amount of data that I need to send. And if I would do this, for example, for an anonymous GraphQL API, then I could again at that point use an HTTP cache to cache that GraphQL request. But it really depends on what your use case are and how requests will differ from one request to another on how you would approach caching.
All right, and I actually feel like, as this is a Drupal show, we may have walked right past an elephant and not realized it. But one of the killer apps, I think, for Drupal, especially for the site building crew, is Drupal views, right? So, views, I can look at all the data in my Drupal site. I can describe what fields I want. I can, decide what format they're going to show up in. But at the same time, right, views sort of by its nature is also trying to put out the HTML around those things. And then we have something like GraphQL where it's just saying like all you want to get is the data, but you as like the end point application can describe what structure you want that data to be in. Maybe sometimes you get to make choices about what format you want those things to be in. But is there any sort of like current connection like in the GraphQL module between GraphQL and views, or are those things you either going to use a view or you're going to use GraphQL?
There's no connection right now. So as I mentioned, the GraphQL Compose module, I think they may have actually launched their beta yesterday or the day before at the time of recording. They do, like, that module offers integration, I think, with media, with paragraphs, and just with nodes. And I can see that they may have plans to offer customizability there. So maybe they'll end up at something similar to views, where you take your Drupal data schema and then use that to describe your API. But I think maybe views directly would be less useful there.
Yeah, I mean, I saw like there's some things in there about like describing routes and menu items and menu attributes. So there's a lot of like interesting sort of like native Drupal things, especially if you're familiar with the Drupal 8 and 9 world. But one of the things I wondered, I was like, blocks. I didn't see that in here, but maybe it is.
I'm not too familiar with the module. We mostly write our own code to match up data to the API.
It's that time of the show where I think we've gotten to the seeds and the stems, as they say in winemaking. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Nick's dog for making an appearance. We really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about GraphQL.
My pleasure.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, you can sign up for a newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
All right. Alexander, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about GraphQL or Open Social or all things web, how would they go about doing that?
So I'm in the Drupal Slack on Drupal.org and on Twitter under the handle King Dutch. Or you can go to my website, alexandervarwijk.com. And I'm most active on Twitter if you want to reach me, or ping me in the GraphQL channel on the Drupal Slack.
Great. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, I go by Liberator without the last vowel on pretty much every platform, Drupal.org and Slack, Twitter, Instagram, things like that. So look for me and say hello. And if you happen to be in the Pacific Northwest, come to the Portland Drupal meetup. We are always doing something fun.
And Ryan, I forgot to say at the top of the show, but I think we owe you a happy birthday. Did you have a birthday yesterday? Or
yesterday as we record, that's right. It is my 40th trip around the sun.
Well,
Happy birthday.
congratulations, and looking for 40 or 50 more for you.
Thanks very much.
Nick, where can people find you online?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixman, Nicxvan.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one, everyone.